The Iran-Iraq War began in 1980 with an Iraqi invasion of Iran due to various grievances, and Saddam Hussein felt that Iran was weak enough from the Iranian Revolution to be able to be attacked by Iraq. However, Saddam was very wrong, and the war stretched out until 1988. There are many aspects, campaigns, and operations that occurred during the war which could have changed the outcome of it, but that's not what today's video is about. Today's video is about what if the Iran-Iraq War didn't end with a stalemate and the ceasefire that had happened in 1988. I am not asking what if one side defeated the other at any point in time during the war, but rather what if the war kept going on past the 1988 ceasefire that had happened in our timeline. But before we get into our scenario, we must examine why and how the ceasefire and end of the war came to be. There were several ceasefire and peace proposal attempts which were rejected by both Iran and Iraq throughout the war at different times. By 1988, Iraq saw massive foreign support, Iran was increasingly isolated by the international community, and had strong war weariness as Saddam Hussein threatened to launch a renewed bombing attack on Iranian cities using WMDs in the middle of 1988. Iraq had also launched a very successful renewed offensive which retook much of the lost land that Iran had taken throughout the war, and the Iraqis also drove deep into Iran. Well, relatively deep. The UN Security Council Resolution 598 was also the resulting ceasefire which took effect on August of 1988, and neither side really won the war. With these conditions in mind, let's get into our scenario. Either Iran and/or Iraq will deny the UN resolution, as will make Saddam not threaten a WMD attack on Iranian cities. Instead, we'll have him imply the attack, as he made extensive use of WMDs during the war, and it was no secret when chemical attacks were going on during the Iran-Iraq War. So, Saddam threatens more bombing attacks on Iranian cities, and the Ayatollah will be unconvinced by war weariness without a direct threat of WMDs. Additionally, since Iraq was winning the war, again, it's possible that we can make Saddam deny the ceasefire even if Iran accepts it, because, well, Saddam wasn't the most rational guy. As I've stated, Iraq was on the offensive in 1988, and if the war continued, the pressure mounts on Iran. The Tawakkul ala Allah operations from April to July of 1988 in our timeline resulted in the mass Iraqi liberation of territory which had been under Iranian occupation, and resulted in the Iraqi recapture of 9,600 square kilometers of Iranian land. This was a major factor in Iran accepting the ceasefire, but in this alternate timeline where Iran refuses, then Iraq starts to plow through Iran and the Khuzestan region, where the Iranian morale is practically non-existent as the state becomes bankrupt. Since Iraq is crushing Iran, I feel like the foreign suppliers of Iraq would roll back some of their support during this phase of the war. The MEK is another aspect of the Iran-Iraq War which I have to include, which could heavily impact our scenario, especially in 1988 at the end of the war with what had happened in our timeline. In 1988, the MEK had conducted Operation 40 Stars in our timeline, which was a successful offensive against the Iranians in June. A month later, in July, Iran launched Operation Mersad, which defeated the MEK and executed many political prisoners. These operations had also forced Iran to consider negotiating. In this alternate timeline, we'll have these operations be slightly delayed to boost, very slightly, Iran's very low morale into continuing the war. Relating back to the ongoing scenario, Iraq drives further into Iran after July of 1988, and it's possible that Iran might divert more forces away from the MEK in this alternate Operation 40 Stars and Operation Mersad. But I mean, in our timeline, Operation Mersad saw 210,000 Iranians engage against 7,000 MEK, so I guess maybe Iraq might provide more air support to the MEK during Operation Mersad, and it could be less successful as Saddam might want the MEK to help him run Khuzestan after the war because, well, there's no way that the MEK are going to completely overthrow the Ayatollah. Either way, Iran is further crippled by the MEK and ongoing Iraqi offensive. The tanker war aspect of the Iran-Iraq War is also extended to however long this war lasts. Operations Earnest Will and Prime Chance are extended against Iran, and it's possible that operations like Praying Mantis are repeated against Iran, as the US wanted the war to end as soon as possible with as little Iranian harassment of shipping as possible. So we'll have an increased US presence against Iran in the Gulf to protect Kuwaiti shipping in the late 1980s, and it's possible that this goes on into the 90s depending on how long the war lasts. This will impact how Iraq treats Kuwait at the end of the Iran-Iraq War, so stay tuned for that. Something else that I'll mention here as a side note is that there's a slim potential, but still very unlikely chance that Dukakis wins the 1988 American presidential election due to American aid to the Iraqi regime and an increased American presence in the Gulf, but I really don't think much of anything would have changed in American politics in 1988 as a result of the Iran-Iraq War still ongoing, as it had little impact in our timeline. This alternate Iran-Iraq War probably ends in early 1990, and Iraq has annexed Khuzestan but doesn't have the resources to topple the Iranian regime, which is now barely standing after losing the war. Iraq would still have a massive war debt, and it would want to pay back these debts with Khuzestan's oil-rich region. The UN condemns Iraq's annexation, but nobody can really do anything about it. Within Iran, there are groups which want regime change or possibly want to secede from the country due to Iran's poor economic and military state. How this goes down would be too difficult for me to predict in this alternate 1990, but one important thing to note is that nobody sees Iran as a regional powerhouse anymore. Tragically, the Kurdish genocide of the Al-Anfal campaign would still happen in this alternate timeline. With an Iraqi offensive ongoing in 1988 during the end of the war, it's possible that the U.S. might do some negotiation to forgive some war debt in exchange for an earlier end to the Kurdish genocide, assuming, of course, that we maintain the condition that Iran is the one who won't accept the UN Security Council Resolution 598 for a ceasefire. In an ideal world, Saddam would accept this deal to boost his military campaign against Iran and to have a better post-war economic outlook, but Saddam wasn't the most rational guy to run Iraq, so I have no idea how this alternate potential deal might go down. At the end of the war, there's still a probable invasion of Kuwait by Iraq like that had happened in our timeline, but it would have to be later as American troops are still in the region in 1990 and likely depart in 1991. Kuwait and Iraq still have their oil disputes like they had done in our timeline, but Iraq does have Khuzestan to produce oil. Still, though, I think that Saddam would be stupid enough to invade Kuwait in early 1992. This alternate Gulf War is undoubtedly a coalition victory, and it would likely give Khuzestan its independence after the war and leave Iraq in ruins. The coalition would also give autonomy to the Kurdish region of Iraq like that had happened in our timeline with enforced no-fly zones. The Iraqi uprisings would probably go the same as they had done in our timeline, as the Iran-Iraq War victory would likely offset the pure stupidity of invading Kuwait for oil after annexing Khuzestan by Saddam. In our timeline, coalition forces didn't go in and topple Saddam partially because George H.W. Bush had feared that Iran would capitalize on the instability in Iraq, and U.S. intelligence didn't know how demoralized and in shambles Iran was in a real 1991. With Iran not a threat in this alternate timeline, it's very hard to tell if the coalition might enact regime change or still rely on the Iraqi military to do so. One thing that is for sure, though, is that in this alternate 1992, there is a massive boost in the polls for President H.W. Bush in the United States as he had a 90% approval rating during the Gulf War in our timeline. I see no reason why he wouldn't have the same approval ratings in this alternate Gulf War. Therefore, I feel like he would likely win re-election in 1992 despite the recession. Whether or not the coalition goes all the way in toppling Saddam Hussein, and how this alternate version of Iraq, with or without Saddam, would act in the post-Gulf War alternate world is too hard for me to accurately predict in this scenario. But that's just one possibility for if the Iran-Iraq War had continued instead of ending in a stalemate with the UN Resolution 598. What do you think would have happened had the war not ended in 1988 and continued past the ceasefire? Let me know in the comments below, and thank you for watching.